In talking generally about history, we said that history, or historians, should strive to give us explanatory accounts of the past. But what makes something an explanatory account or an explanation? Explanations may have an essential common core, or the notion of explanation may resemble what Ludwig Wittgenstein called a family resemblance concept, whose members need not share the same set of features, but may be more loosely connected by various similarities. One can also attend to different philosophical aspects of explanation, such that one asks about their logical structure, that is, one can ask, are explanations deductive arguments, or can inductive arguments be explanatory? Can diagrams and pictures give explanations? Can narratives or stories explain? One can also ask about the epistemic import of explanation. So philosophers ask questions such as, what are the criteria for good explanations? Who decides what counts as a good explanation in a given domain? What is the difference between explanation and prediction? Finally, one can ask, what are the pragmatic virtues of explanations? Should good explanations be simple? Should they be unified? Should they give us more control over the world? These questions are pertinent even if we consider that explanation has an essence or a common core, or if we consider that explanation is a family resemblance concept. Explanation in history or historiography concerns past events. Events come in smaller or larger clumps. Also, explanation in historiography comes in many different sorts and shapes. This is because different historians will be interested in different aspects of the smaller or larger clumps of events, and also because historiographic facts are underdetermined by the evidence. So, historiographical explanation come in many different shapes and sizes. So we'll have to say more about this. But before we get to this variety or pluralism of historiographical explanation, we need to say something about a philosophical model that for a very long time influenced the way philosophers talk about explanation in history. This is the so-called deductive nomological model of explanation. I know, it is a mouthful. So I'll tell you in a bit where this name comes from. To avoid saying such a long name, I'll just say the DN model. This has been articulated and defended most notably by Hempel and Oppenheim in 1984, and then applied to explanation in history by Hempel. According to this account, an explanation is legitimate as an explanation if and only if it provides a way to deductively derive a description of the event being explained, or the explanandum, from a statement of a law and a description of some initial conditions. Or if this law statement, together with the description of the initial conditions, make the occurrence of the thing we want to explain highly probable. Since this account clearly makes the presence of a law essential to all explanation, it is called nomological. Another name for it is that sometimes used is the covering law model of explanation. Hempel himself acknowledged that nomological explanations in history are not fully fledged deductive arguments that show how some phenomenon can be derived from some law and some initial conditions. Hempel acknowledged that nomological explanations in history are not fully fledged deductive arguments. Instead, explanations in history, he thought, are typically elliptical explanations, partial explanation, or explanation sketches. So, elliptical explanation do not make explicit mention of the laws presumed in the explanation, or do so only elusively, more or less vaguely. The explanation is elliptical because the explanans requires completion. Also, he said that some explanations are partial. Partial explanations are called still deductive nomological explanations because the explanandum is derivable from the explanans only if it is described in terms more general than those initially given. So, this style of explanation works by explaining the occurrence of an action of a generic type P where the target action is of a more specific kind Q. Finally, Hempel thought that some explanations in history are explanation sketches. These are neither specific enough nor complete enough to qualify as either elliptical or partial. Some explanations that are explanation sketches in history may suggest, perhaps persuasively, the general outlines of what might eventually be supplemented so as to yield a deductive nomological argument, so they can be completed to become either elliptical or partial explanations. Now, there have been many criticisms of the deductive nomological account of explanation, especially as applied to the historical sciences. I'll mention 4 of these criticisms. Some of the most important objections raised against applying the DN model of explanation to historiography include the fact that the account extrapolates from the highly idealized case of explanation in physics, or precisely something like explanations in Newtonian mechanics, and it applies it to all explanations in all fields. A second important criticism is that explanation sketches, contrary to what Hempel believed, can be very persuasive, and they don't need to be made either more precise or more complete in order to count as genuine or good explanations. Another criticism is that the account ignores the fact that the partiality of explanation depends on the context of inquiry. So explanations are partial because in a certain context, we don't need all of the information. And finally, even if the covering law account of explanation covers macro-historical explanations, there are other types of historical explanations it cannot accommodate. In particular, historical explanations of particular events. And as we'll see in what follows, narratives are considered to be providing a much better model for how explanation of particular events in history works. The deductive nomological model of explanation works for a very limited number of cases of explanations provided by historians. There are other types of historiographical explanation that must be taken into account. For instance, classification. This might come as a surprise, but classification can provide the type of understanding that explanations are said to deliver. Classification is based on an interpretive process that integrates into a whole otherwise disconnected features of a certain period or series of events. Classification implies the subsumption of some events or actions under a concept, and this may be illuminating in the way that an explanation ought to be. Consider a question that might be treated by a historian: has there ever been a feminist revolution? In other cases, the purpose of historical inquiry is to shed some light on a particular set of events, the assumption being that the relevant factors would be causally influential in bringing about those events. So, some historiographical explanations are multifactorial, causal explanation. Consider the question, what brought about the fall of the Berlin Wall? Finally, one has to consider historiographic explanations of particular events and actions. We saw that this don't fit neatly in the deductive nomological model of explanations. In some cases, historiographical explanations set events in a context and a place, and these series of events can be seen as having a connected thread. It is, in these cases, the connecting thread that is said to supply the explanatory insight. It's because of the relevance of the connection that one sees the explained event as being plausible or even inevitable. These are so-called narrative explanations. What is narrative, and How has it influenced historiography and the view of explanation in history? The term narrative, as applied to historiography, suggests that a historiographic text is basically a story told by the historian about some aspects of the past. So from a cognitive perspective, the text written by the historian can be analyzed in three components. So the historiographic text has three components, like individual statements or statements of individual facts, descriptions of events, the explanation that the text provides, we'll return to this in a moment, and the so-called holistic narrative. This is the kind of tying together of all the elements considered to be relevant to provide the explanation of the target event. So narrative analysis in historiography assumes that the cognitive message of a historical account or story is in the text as a whole rather than in its constituent parts. So only by focusing on the text as a whole one can achieve a correct understanding of some part or aspect of the past. And in this sense, that narratives provide a sui generis form of explanation. This idea of narrative or narrativism has been applied to historiography in two rather distinct ways. These are the so-called philosophical approach to narrative in history, so the philosophical approach, and the rhetorical approach. We will focus primarily on the philosophical approach, but I'll tell you a bit about both. The philosophical approach is concerned with clarifying the relationship between the language that the historian uses to describe certain events of the historical text and the past that this language is used to recount. So what is the relationship between the two? How do we know that a particular story captures something that really happened in the past? Whereas the rhetorical approach is an approach that's concerned to show how literary theory might be fruitfully applied to analyzing historical text. A few words about the philosophical approach. So what I said is that this approach is interested to show how narrative clarifies the relationship between language used to tell a story about the past and the past. And within philosophy, there are basically two positions about what this relationship is. There's the realist position, and the so-called nominalist position. The realist claims that the historical text describes aspects of the past as they were. So, historical texts describe the past as it were. Whereas the nominalist position holds that this relationship between the text and the past remains undetermined. So we cannot say anything about the relationship between text and past. So the conflict between the realist and the nominalist seems to be unsurpassable. One solution that has been proposed by Hans Michael Baumgartner is so-called a transcendental solution. Transcendental arguments are very general in philosophy. I'll just tell you what's the core of this argument for this particular debate. So the idea of Baumgartner is that the unity and continuity that one attributes to the history are the product of the narrative synthesis, and do not mirror any sort of thing about the object or event existing in the past. So, in this case, we can say that the narrative explains as narrative because only through the narrative unity is achieved. This also supports the idea that narrative explanation is what differentiates history from other sciences. I would like to end this presentation by asking you to reflect on a question. So we have seen that there are many types of historiographical explanations, and that the deductive nomological model does not fit all of them, because we have classifications, explanations of particular events, explanations that are multifactorial. But we have not explored the idea that all historical explanations might be causal explanations. And what follows, I will propose an answer to this question, but I also want you to reflect on other possibilities of answering this query. We have seen that the narrative structure of historiographical account is what presents us with the most important challenge to the deductive nomological model of explanation. Narratives are important in history because they allow historians to focus on actions of individual agents. In narrative accounts, we see why some action was performed when we know the motivational, maybe psychological aspect of a particular certain situation, the context, social and physical, within which an agent was acting. But one might also point out that significant events and reports of these significant events are often very complicated. So one cannot attribute only psychological states to historical actions in order to explain the occurrence of some event. The task of the historian in these cases is to embed the accounts that mention psychological states and the social and physical context in which some agents are acting into a much broader account, which comprises a mix of causal factors. So, narrative explanations can be distinctively particular. It can pay due attention to particular context in all its complexity and provide good explanations of actions arising from those contexts. It can do this while reducing the sheer contingency of what is explained, but it also does this because the factors cited in the narrative explanation are causally related in various ways to the events they explain. So narratives, I said, can be distinctively explanatory. They can focus on individual events, but they do so when they connect the different factors causally. So, I have said that historiographic explanation come in many forms. Sometimes general claims form an essential component, whereas at other times only the particular circumstances and psychological states of the agent need to be mentioned. In the first case, the generalizations are likely to be laws only in a very loose sense, one that allows for the law to be imprecisely formulated and limited in scope. These cases seem to fit to some degree the old deductive nomological model of explanation. But this also leaves room for narrative explanation, a form of causal explanation, or so I claimed, that does not make essential use of laws, even if the causal relation might require there to be a law covering the relation. Singular causal explanation work because they specify a cause in play, or more than one cause, not because there is a law in the background. So, my presentation partly vindicates the appeal of the deductive nomological model for some, perhaps a very limited number, of explanation in historiography of macrophysical events, macrohistorical events, but it also allows for there being particular narrative explanations in historiography.